Hello and welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how to do an ink and wash. This is one that I did a while ago and I thought it'd be nice to try it again. It's like different style. And what I've done is try to put in all the strategic areas. I started with the ridge tiles and then put the doors in, and then went back to finding the holes in the tiles and the ivy. Then I added some other things, but you can add as little or as much as you like, but the idea of the ink and wash is it sets the shape and form and then you just add the colour. So I've drawn it very roughly, and today I'm using these Edding pens. I've got 2 or 3 of them. They do come in different widths. This is an 01. So to start with, you could, if you wanted, use a pen that you dip in ink, but for filming purposes that's a little bit messy today. First thing I'm going to do is to put in the ridge tiles because they set the scene. So I'm going to use some Indian red or Venetian red and some cadmium orange. Just mix them together. Now the tiles have got growth on and there's one missing, so I'll start with the big line and just drop it in to claim the space. And I've tinted the orange because this is old and weathered. It's not like you've just bought it from the builders merchants. There's a degree of age here. This was an old pigsty. If you're going hunting for it, I'm sorry to say somebody's restored it now. And just put the ridge tile down the other side there. Now I'm going to get some more orange, mix a slightly different colour with a little bit of bright red. Any red will do. That's cadmium red, I think. Just drop it into the wet paint. Took me a minute or two to get going on that, but got the right degree now. And it makes it look more natural and the colour finds its own way. There's some rusty metal, so I'm going to use burnt sienna and again dip it into the same orange to give continuity through the picture. Make it a little bit darker. And that helps me find things. And then there's some rusty door fittings, so I'm going to use a smaller brush and slightly darker colour. So I'm going to use some raw umber in it and a little bit French ultramarine. Just mix it all up, make a slightly darker brown. And then there's a little padlock and a catch. This may seem a bit tedious, but if you've got a very bleached door, anything on it will look striking. Now we've got lots of wood that's bleached, so I'm going back to the bigger brush and adding some Naples yellow to the brown, a little bit more French ultramarine, just to make a more silvery colour. And just put in a few wooden supports. Now obviously I've drawn it again. I haven't drawn it for a while. I might have missed something out, but it's all part of the joy of it. You don't necessarily want to put in everything. And if I find that I've got really big gaps, then I can come back to it. I'm not doing any harm. I'm just going to give that a nice neat edge there. So now I'm going to put in some stonework which might need a couple of coats. So I'm going to mix up a grey with Naples yellow and cobalt turquoise and Azilian crimson. It's quite a warm grey. And I'm going to mix up a colder grey with French ultramarine, Azilian crimson and yellow ochre, and then use those to play off against each other. So I'm going to start here where I've got a door that's hardly showing, it's well underneath the ivy. So I'm going to go down in a straight line. There's the planks of a door wood, and then drop in some of the other grey just in little lines. Leave a ragged edge because there's so much grass, it's a job to see anything. And then moving across to the second door, I'm going to do it in reverse. I'm using the lighter grey first, going round the fittings as much as possible. I'm just going to add a tiny bit of blue that's very watered down, almost clear water. Just drop it in. This is very, very watery French ultramarine. Then go back to the warmer grey and just put it in. I can add some tinting later, and then we've got a dark door at the other end that survived a bit more. So I'm going to mix a dark brown out of indigo and burnt sienna and a little bit of blue. I want it to be slightly duller. And again, that's got planks, so I'll just drop them in and add a little bit of brown just to lighten it in places. Sort of like wood after the rain, it's slightly darker. And in my first drawing there was a little bit of paint left, so we can put the paint somewhere else this time because no two drawings are the same. Well, this time we leave the outer plank painted. I'll then take it down to the grass. Now the next step is to put on the roof, which I'm going to use Payne's grey and blue mixed together just to give a slate colour. So it's French ultramarine and Payne's grey. If you haven't got Payne's grey, you can make a very dark homemade grey. And I'm starting on the right hand side and just putting in a straight line, or straightish, to show where the tiles are, and then dropping in some grey just to show that it's catching the light. Then back to the blue mix, and there's some huge holes in this roof, which is what appealed to me, so I'm just going to go round some of those. I'll go back in afterwards. It makes the orange paint stand out nicely. And a bit more of the grey just to give change in colour the way the sun's hitting it. A bit more blue. You see the ink's doing a lot of the work for you. And I need to mix a different colour slightly just to go here. Going back to it because I wanted to give different emphasis. You don't want to do the whole thing from left to right. That's got to dry, so I can't put the holes in the roof yet. What I can do is do the lane. So I'm going to get a slightly bigger brush and just put in the warm colours of a lane. I don't necessarily want to put any ruts in the lane. Take the grass level up to it. And this is rag paper, and it's developed a life of its own in this corner. It's got a bit of a pattern. Well, that doesn't matter. So now I'll go back to the top above the ridge tiles, which in this case was all a bit brown and wintry. So I'm mixing raw umber and burnt sienna together. It's making a brown colour, and then adding a little bit of Payne's grey to the grey. I'm not going to add any more paint now, I'm going to move it. And then when it's dry, or nearly dry, I'll add some indication of growth. I'm going to use some sap green and just drop a few little dots in. Not everything has died off with winter. There's still some degree of things happening. I'll get the small brush, number 1, and just get a much darker brown. Just put a few lines in. And then come back in with some greeny brown, mix them together so it's a different colour. Just put in a few little marks, wiggly lines, just to break it up a bit. A bit more green. The green will make the orange show even more. And again, I've got this handmade paper that's gone a bit spotty, but we'll use it to our advantage. So the next thing to do is the wall. So I'm going to mix up some Naples yellow with a little bit of the grey I mixed earlier and go over all the stones. And then go back in from the other side with a slightly bluer mix. Which will help the door stand out. And then just drift the two colours into each other. This side there's no stone showing at all, it's all ivy, but I've got a lot more stone here and it's slightly nearer so it can be better defined. So I'm going in with the blue and then pulling the paint sideways with Naples yellow on the brush. Now going in with some yellow ochre just to warm up certain areas. Just taking the brush for a walk. I've given the roof slates a moment to dry and I'm now going in with Payne's Grey. If you haven't got Payne's Grey, you can mix lamp black with a bit of blue, or just keep mixing all your colours together till you get a very dark effect. I'm using a number 3 brush with a reasonable point to get near the edge of the tiles because the shape of them helps the picture. And then just coming down the doorway, leaving space for some ivy that's growing there, and put that in as a different colour. You have to take a bit of time to get the angles right here. What I can do is just drop a little bit of blue in. That makes the roof stand out a lot more. And then coming down, I've got ivy going across. So I'm just going to leave a few little marks, but most of it I'm doing as complete shadow. And that makes the door stand out then. I'm going around the shape of the stones. And then just lightening it at the bottom because the sun will be shining in there a little way. And coming across the roof, I'm leaving room for the timber, then going in behind it. You do need a brush with a good point to do this. And then there's 1 or 2 further holes in the roof. Just working my way across. Doesn't matter how many you put in or leave out, it just develops as you're drawing it. I will go back and make some of these slightly darker in a moment, but I'm just finding a few more holes that took my interest, so I'm just mixing in some more Payne's grey just to make it a bit stronger, adding a bit of indigo this time. I'm just going to drop it in, find its own way. Anything that's slightly nearer might be slightly darker. And then just the top half of the doorway. I won't put anything in the bottom half because that will be getting some sunshine, but I want a lost edge, so I'm just pulling down 1 or 2 streaks. And there's also a little hole here. And a couple of little holes above it. Just slip those in. And then there's a big shadow down the side of the door, which I do need a slightly thinner brush for. It goes under the ivy. So while I've got the thinner brush, I can just tidy up some of these others. Need a better edge. When you're dealing with man-made items, sometimes a crisp edge can just give better visual impact. So that's given a good start. So now I'm going to go in with bright green and highlight the ivy. Now to make the ivy come out, it's got to be dark at the bottom but light at the top. So I'm going to start with lemon yellow and sap green mixed together. Just put in a wavy line where it meets the roof. And then going back to the sap green and adding a little bit of yellow ochre, just putting it in wet on wet, letting the colours bleed together. And I've gone so far, now it's time to add some blue. So I'm going to add French ultramarine, more sap green, and carry on in the same manner, up and down strokes. I'm now going to put in some Payne's grey, just very, very lightly. And change brushes and move some of the paint that was already there around. Just move it down onto the Payne's grey. Try and cover the white paper. And up to the top, moving that from a lot. It made its own line. So I'm just moving it slightly and a few strokes going the other way. And the far side here is much darker, so I'm going to add more French ultramarine and more sap green, making a really strong colour. And just go in from the edge. And it does need a little bit of yellow ochre just to warm it up slightly, and then taking it onto the roof tiles. But there's still roof tiles showing. It hasn't quite fully captured it yet. And then a little bit more lemon yellow just to mix around, and then back to the first colour. Just makes it look more like natural foliage. And a smaller brush, slightly stronger colour, and just put in some shape and form to the ivy. Bring it across the door and across the shadows. This is a number 1 brush. And as it's going onto the roof, it needs to be quite dappled, so I'm just taking the brush for a walk. And then going back in, there would be stone here, but it's covered, so I'm just covering the white paper. I'll leave that to dry for a moment and go somewhere else. So I'm going to the grass. So these are different greens, so I'll start with yellow ochre and mix it into the greens I've already got. Just make a line and a darker line, and then just do the brush through them. Just tickling the paint up and down. And a slightly bit more. If you put, this is a size 4 brush, but if you put it on its tip, you can still get very precise marks. And moving further in, got some red there because I had red on my finger without knowing it, but it doesn't matter. A little bit more lemon yellow. Just lifts the grass a little bit. Make it a bit lower by the entrance because I'm sure animals go in there to shelter. And then under the ivy needs to be a different colour again, so I'm just going to add a little bit of blue and do the grass in a different direction. And when that's dry, I can add some detail. Using a size 1 brush, just moving the paint gently, just to give a little suggestion. And the same with some of the ivy at the top here. There's some brown, which just gives a bit of a transition between the colour change. There's probably other plants that were trying to do battle with the ivy. In the next stage, I'm going to get a flat brush, very useful to have a flat brush, and a little bit more French ultramarine. Dry the brush off a little bit and go back on. Some of the slates are much bluer than others, so I'm just going to put in a few marks to show some of the darker slates. By using a flat brush, and cover the area without disturbing anything else because it does it in one sweep. By making them a fraction darker in certain places, it shows the warmth of the stone. And for some reason, the ones on the end aren't darker, but I'm just going to put a little bit on there because I don't want it to look odd. And I couldn't put an area of dark on earlier because it was all a bit wet. So I can now just drop in another area between the old beams. I'll just make that another dark area. Very easy to get lost when you're doing this. But say every drawing is different. And now I need to just put a bit more definition on some of the stone. So I'm mixing up a warm grey, mixing everything on my palette together. Some of these stones have gone a bit green from the ivy. And they perhaps don't get the sun because it's bellowing out over the top of them. And then some brown, just make the door have a few darker streaks. Just letting the brush skip over the tooth of the paper. And the same on the other side. Now it's all dry, you can just put in a little bit more definition. Now this one's perfectly silver, it's got no definition at all, so I need to make the stonework around it a bit darker. So I'm just adding some yellow ochre to a grey mix, and I'm just going to follow the line of the door round and then pull the paint out sideways. And the same here, just pull the paint out a little bit. And there is a wooden surround either side of the shadow there. And then certain areas of the tiles are still darker again, so I'm just going to get some more French ultramarine and mix it with the grey. Just go back in and just touch the odd tile. Following the ink lines. And then get a damp brush and lose one edge. And you could, if you wanted to, put more ink on top. That works quite well. I've just added a few more highlights and shadows where it was dry. And a little line underneath the ivy that's sticking out. But you can go back and put more ink in if you want to. Just get the same ink pen and just decide that you'll put a few strikes of grass on. It's perfectly all right to do it on top. Just have to decide on the level that you want. But I hope this will make you have a go. If you haven't got one of these pens, a biro will work perfectly well. I've got sketches in my sketchbook where I forgot to take a pencil and I've done a sketch in biro and it took the watercolour on top perfectly. But always experiment on a little corner first. Thank you very much for watching.